All right, welcome to, that was a fantastic program that we just heard, the panel on AI, and there were so many questions. We need to do a follow-up at some point. I'm very pleased to be part of a panel here, and we want to welcome you to Ensuring Equitable Housing for All, Reimagining, Bureaucracy, and Delivering for People. We have an incredible housing crisis, as we all know. We've heard this when we had a program in LA. We heard a number of issues for 3 days about the housing crisis. The fact that 8.5 million people pay more than 50% of their income for rent. The fact that there's no affordable housing to be had. The fact that even in Vermont, we're approaching $1,500 for studio apartments. I think the list goes on and on. I'm not going to belabor it because I think you've all heard it. But there is an incredible wealth inequality and affordable housing crisis impacting working class families throughout America. What we have here now, which is exciting, is some innovative new approaches to reimagine how to change the housing system. I'd like to introduce our panelists, Nika Soon-Shiong, who is the founder and executive director of the Fund for Guaranteed Income. It's a public charity that builds community-designed technologies to implement cash transfer programs in 12 American cities. One of the first ones was Compton, California, and that has been going very, very well. She's also worked in Africa and a number of other areas. Our other panelist is Brian McCabe, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Policy Development at HUD in the Office of Policy Development and Research. His research has covered a range of housing policy issues, including the politics of homelessness and rental assistance. So welcome our panelists, and I will sit down, and I'm just going to moderate because they have a lot to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Nika Soon-Shiong, and I founded the Fund for Guaranteed Income out of a belief that massive wealth redistribution is an urgent necessity. And our first program, the Compton Pledge, is unlike the Giving Pledge. It's not about giving as charity. It's about individuals' inherent rightful share of the nation's resources. So we sent over $10 million in guaranteed income payments. And guaranteed income, or universal basic income, it's a policy of direct recurring cash transfers without conditions or work requirements. And it's not a policy to allocate money to a person if they only spend it on certain kinds of foods, or if they work, or if they spend it on rent in certain neighborhoods. It's an investment in humanity, and it's not an investment to transform your life, but because you are alive. And so because of the power of this idea at the Fund for Guaranteed Income, we advance it by doing two things. We research government bureaucracies, and we join hands with movement leaders across the country to design a safety net that actually lives up to its name. And our approach is quite simple and straightforward. We have to make it as easy as possible to access assistance like housing assistance, and we have to make it work. So in Compton, we designed a payments platform to send money from the government to people in 4 different methods with payment reminders on WhatsApp, live support, and it identifies other benefits gaps. And we were successful in doing this because we partnered with 35 different community groups to design it. And we were the ones on the other end of the phone figuring out why somebody wasn't able to receive their card. And so the time is now actually to move from this phase of piloting into addressing a new model for the safety net as it exists today. Saru from One Fair Wage yesterday spoke about a worker who said that if they didn't have to work 2 jobs, what would they do? They would want to work on climate, on education. And that doesn't have to be an impossible future. What I see is that Christine, who is a Compton Pledge participant, She used money from the pledge and started a local nonprofit in Compton with her church for hot meals and mobile showers to the homeless community. So again, it's not that people don't know what to do or that they aren't working hard enough. And beyond disproving welfare stereotypes, this really indicates and proves the ripple effects that direct investment in people can have.
Brian, why don't you take it from there? Give us a little bit of information about what you're working on in HUD.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. I'd be happy to. And really nice to be here. My name is Brian McCabe. I'm on the faculty at Georgetown University, and I currently serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development at HUD. I work in the Office of Policy Development and Research. So sort of our office is tasked with thinking about the kinds of evidence that we have, the kinds of data and research we have to inform public policy at HUD. This is through external contracted research, through research we do inside the agency, and also through large demonstration programs, which is sort of the seeds of what I think we're talking about today. I'm very much a sort of outsider to the inside of HUD, right, an academic for my career, but for the last couple of years have really gotten to see sort of how the bureaucracy works, and it's been incredibly enlightening to understand where it works and where it's falling short. And I think that's what we want to talk about today, is how we can take those places where it's falling short and sort of make it better, right? Be innovative and be creative. And I'm really excited to be here with Nika. As we've been talking about direct rental assistance, we've learned a ton from the evidence from guaranteed income programs, from pilots across the country. So it's a really important link between guaranteed income and direct rental assistance. I want to just sort of frame the conversation with something we talk a lot about in the housing policy space, which is that 1 out of 4 income-eligible households in the United States receives rental assistance of any kind. It could be in LIHTC properties, tax credit properties that are subsidized, in public housing or housing vouchers. But when we take all the programs, the federal, the state, and the local programs, only 1 out of 4 households that is eligible for those programs actually receives a benefit, right? And when I talk to folks about it, I make the comparison between something like Medicaid or nutritional assistance. What if only 1 out of 4 households in America that was eligible to receive nutritional assistance actually got that assistance, right? The kind of inequality that we're creating by having this, by using our rental assistance programs and not serving everybody that's eligible. The largest program that we run through HUD, and the one that we're going to talk about today, is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, sometimes known as Section 8. Same program, but I'll refer to it as the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And just to sort of lay the quick groundwork, and we'll get into some of the details of where it's working and where it's falling short, but this is the way that the program works. So we'll imagine a place like Burlington. A low-income renter wants to get access to the Housing Choice Voucher Program. First, they have to enter a lottery run by the local housing authority, right? So you enter a lottery just to get on the wait list. If you win the lottery, you get on the wait list and you wait anywhere from, maybe you get it tomorrow. I was in Philadelphia a couple years ago. The wait was 10 years to get off that wait list. People that won the lottery were waiting for 10 years on that wait list. After you get off the wait list, you have to be certified as income eligible. You verify your income and any preferences that you were selected under. At that point, you're issued a voucher to go search for housing on the private market, right, to find a private rental unit. As you can imagine, in these hot housing markets, lots of discrimination, rising prices, incredibly difficult for renters to find, renters with a voucher to find housing in these markets. There's a new study that I'll share a little bit more about from NYU's Furman Center that finds that only about 60% of households with a voucher actually end up finding housing on the market. And the other 40%, they take that voucher that they've often waited years for, that they won the lottery to get, and they return it right to the housing authority unused. So, this story plays out in communities across the country. Because the voucher program is run by local housing authorities, there are more than 2,200 housing authorities across the country running the voucher program. The sort of story is slightly different in each place, but the broad narrative is the same, right? And that is that the voucher program is certainly working for some households, but it's not working for a lot of households. It's not working for most households. And so the concept that we want to talk about today that builds out of guaranteed income is about direct rental assistance. What would happen if we gave money to families to pay their housing needs, right? The way the voucher program currently works is that the housing authority pays the money to the landlord, right? And the tenant pays a portion of the rent as well. And I can talk about some of the details. But the way we're thinking about disrupting and some of the challenges in the program that we'll talk about solving today, what would happen if instead of giving money to the landlord to pay the rent, we gave money to the tenant to go shop around and find a unit, to decide which unit best fit their needs in terms of price and location, what kind of trade-offs folks would make if they had the money to spend on housing, to empower people, the dignity of searching for your own unit and paying for it. So that's the sort of fundamental difference between the voucher program and direct rental assistance, is thinking about what would happen if we gave money directly to the tenant rather than giving money to the landlord.
That's very innovative. Nika, could you talk about the new opportunities here?
So I just want to reiterate what Brian said, that 60% of people who gamble to be on a wait list and then are off the wait list and receive a voucher are unable to use it. And 39% of people who are unable to use it cite that it's because they are unable to secure a lease. And so we're launching the Housing Pledge, which is a pilot program of direct rental assistance for people who get off the wait list to immediately be receiving the money that they are eligible for, that they have been allocated by the government via direct cash and resources that they need to utilize the voucher. And so we are looking in multiple different locations, talking to housing authorities, working with Jane Family Institute, Center for Public Enterprise, and partners across the country. And this is a launch of a partnership that's bringing together a new coalition of people to think about reimagining the housing bureaucracy. So how it works today for a renter and a voucher holder after you receive the paper, depending on your jurisdiction, you have as little in some places as 60 days to complete all of these steps. First, you have to find a unit and a landlord that is willing to accept the voucher. This alone takes an average of 60 days. Then you have to wait for the housing authority to conduct a rent reasonableness calculation that, based on your income and the neighborhood of the unit, the rent that you are agreeing to with the landlord is reasonable and not too much. Then you have to wait for the housing authority to conduct a unit inspection, and then you have to wait for the housing authority to sign a payment agreement contract with the landlord as you sign the lease with the landlord. So we cannot change the supply of affordable housing with this pilot, but what we can do is give people the resources and the support that they need to actually utilize the voucher that they've been given by providing a cash on-ramp onto the voucher program. And so in the scenario I just described, instead of waiting for a housing authority to verify the reasonableness of your rent, you negotiate it directly with the landlord. Instead of waiting for a unit inspection, you can conduct one yourself on your cell phone. And instead of waiting for the housing authority to sign that payment agreement with your landlord, you get the rent directly via Venmo or to your bank account automatically every month in a cash transfer, and then you can pay for the full cost of the rent yourself. So beyond this immediate pilot, there are a couple of reasons why I'm really excited about the long-term potential. One is the way that it moves forward the universal basic income movement in the US, and two, because it helps us rethink government investment. So at Fund for Guaranteed Income, we are administering 12 out of 100 different pilots of this idea that giving cash to people works across the country. And I fear that actually the danger of these pilots is that it is reopening a question that's already been answered. We know from evidence from studies of unconditional cash transfer programs around the world, there's Bolsa Familia in Brazil, there's social grants in South Africa, there's Oportunidades in Mexico, that reducing poverty reduces poverty. And the quickest way out sometimes is just through the door. And in the US, we don't have time to wait for more pilots and more data to produce the same results. So the Housing Pledge actually helps us. It's an opportunity to rethink government investment. And remember, the average cost of a voucher is around $10,800. And so the government will spend hundreds of millions on systems to verify the authentic identity of a renter who's claiming to be below the income threshold, claiming to request rent that's at a certain cost. So there's this built-in suspicion, but we also know that for every $1 spent on housing assistance, $8 is spent on policing and prisons, and $12 is spent on national defense. And so really the choice is between the endless war on drugs, America's endless war, or the war on poverty. And actually, guaranteed income is a public safety intervention, and it's a human rights issue. It's a human rights issue that's coming up at a time where America's at a crossroads in terms of its relationship to human rights.
So Nika, you're really talking about providing public services to the public rather than through a bureaucracy that just brings in a lot of administration and a lot of extra cost. We've experienced that with the American Rescue Plan, that money went directly to the people, and we saw a decrease in childhood poverty by more than 40%. I think it was 46%. If that had continued, we would be in a much better place right now. I think that one of the things that we're looking at is that besides there not being resources, accessible resources, the fact that people have to jump through all these hoops and then have such a shortened time to actually finalize housing makes it, as you said, Brian, 1 in 4 are able to access this. Landlords too there's a lot of discrimination and there's a lot of just assumptions that if people are on Section 8 housing or any kind of housing voucher program, that they don't want to deal with the government. No, I'm not going to rent that. So you have an even smaller resource available to people who really need housing. I think one of the things that's happening now also is that Wall Street is buying up a lot of houses. Wall Street investors have bought up 25% of the single homes over the last few years. Ro Khanna's Stop Wall Street Landlords Act is before Congress. And so as the last panel said, call your Congress people and tell them that we need to protect our housing stock. Nika, why don't you talk a little bit more and ask some questions of Brian about what's going on at HUD?
Sure. Brian, will you start by sharing a little bit about the background of HCV, its challenges, its impact, both in your experience and historically?
Sure. So this is a milestone in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. This year is the 50th anniversary of the voucher program. We have a journal issue in Cityscape, which is HUD's journal, coming out this year about sort of celebrating and acknowledging both the milestone but also some of the challenges of the program. So the voucher program comes out of the Housing and Community Development Act in 1974, and I think it's important to think a little bit about the model before that, right? So historically, before the 1970s, our model of rental assistance, of helping low-income families, was through place-based public housing, right? Large public housing developments. But by the 1970s, right, there was a realization that large public housing developments, or public housing developments, what we call place-based public housing, right, was concentrating poverty in certain neighborhoods, was contributing to patterns of racial segregation, and perhaps most importantly was not giving families the choice of where they wanted to live, right? The only assistance available was in certain developments, in certain neighborhoods. And so the idea of a voucher program emerges sort of in response to that, right? That if families had sort of money to spend, they could go shop around, right? And pick which neighborhood or which unit, sort of the combination. And that's why, right, the name Housing Choice Voucher Program is, right, really about housing choice, trying to give families choice in where they want to live. An important part of this history that I want to flag is that in 1970, before the voucher program is established, HUD starts running a demonstration project called the Experimental Housing Allowance Program, EHAP. And its sort of history has been lost to except like a couple nerds within HUD, but there's two important pieces of it. One is, one of the models that was being tested as a housing allowance was a cash allowance, exactly the thing that we're talking about today. So this is not a new idea that we've come up with, right? It's sort of been buried over time, but this is an idea that was being thought about in the 1970s as well. But the other piece of this is that this was a long demonstration, about 10 years to run the program. There were demonstrations to see how housing authorities would respond, how landlords would respond. And before we had the evidence, before the reports were written, Congress passed a law to create the voucher program. So it's a really interesting example of Congress made a decision about the direction of housing policy without the evidence that was going to come out a couple years later. And one of the things that I'm really committed to, and that Nika and I have talked a lot about, is wanting to know how programs work, right? Wanting to build some evidence about what would a direct rental assistance program look like? How would families respond to it? How would landlords respond to it? How would PHAs administer it? And once we have that evidence, we can think about, right, how it is we sort of overturn this bureaucracy with data-driven policies. And so I think that's really important. But that's sort of broadly the history of the voucher program. Over time, it's grown into HUD's largest program. Today, it assists 2.3 million households compared to public housing today, which is just under 1 million households. The other big housing program is the tax credit program. It's actually run through Treasury, and it's about a little over 2 million households as well. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program is our largest rental assistance program, grown very much over time as this has become the model.
Mm-hmm. And the public housing system has been underfunded forever.
Yep.
And so things have fallen into disrepair. I know we've heard from Assemblyman Alex Lee about social housing,
Yeah.
and in Singapore, in Vienna, and now they're doing some of that in Sacramento and California. A number of places are
Yeah.
beginning to look at it. I know New York State has some legislators that are
Yeah.
suggesting that as well. Do you think that that is an area that we might want to move forward on as well?
Yeah, I mean, we have, there are several trains moving here at the same time, right? And so another conversation sort of happening at HUD is about the public housing stock, right? Severely underfunded, right? Capital needs, backlogs. And, the primary way that we've sort of tried to move that forward is through programs that privatize public housing, right? RAD is the big program at HUD. But what Alex Lee and others are talking about, right, an entirely new model of social housing development that is publicly owned, right, publicly managed, and sort of looks different than our historic public housing. And so the work that Alex is doing, there's work in Montgomery County in Maryland around a public development model, but really thinking about the supply side as well, right? Not only how can we make this work for vouchers, but how can we contribute to the development of new housing, right, as part of the affordable housing crisis.
Nika, how do you see that the Fund for Guaranteed Income can help deal with some of the inefficiencies in the federal government? Is there a way that you, as a partner, will be able to help HUD?
I think the first thing is to clarify what what we mean by inefficiencies. So it's not quite that there's too much government. There's too many government officials who need to be automated away and replaced with ChatGPT or something. In fact, HUD's staffing levels have dropped by 50% since the 1990s. And so HUD is currently understaffed to perform essential functions, and that makes its way and affects local public housing authorities, and especially in big cities like New York, like LA. And so given this, it is an inefficient use of HUD officials' time to spend the time evaluating a renter for a voucher, only for that renter not to be able to use it. And this takes an average of 13 hours per voucher holder. And so we should be very concerned at the same time with the inefficient use of low-income renters' time. That's a time tax, the time spent on the waiting list, yes, but then the time spent waiting for a housing authority to evaluate the rent, to conduct the inspection. And it's that direct rental assistance can provide an efficiency to. So we can support someone with cash support right when they get off the wait list. We are looking at how to streamline renters' ability to lease up, how to do so by developing a platform where they are able to conduct certain processes on devices they actually use instead of on paperwork. And I think this is how the Housing Pledge can be a model for these kinds of government partnerships, because it's not about more or about less government, it's about what kind of government interactions and how do those interactions treat someone at every step of the way.
Do you see other places in government in terms of helping the social net, the social safety net? Is this kind of approach applicable there?
Absolutely. I think especially during COVID, we saw many new cash transfer programs, and something that seemed very impossible 3-4 years ago was all of a sudden quite possible. So it's really the model of universal basic income that can be applied is this new understanding that stringent eligibility requirements and verification requirements actually leave people unsupported and humiliated. And subsequently, they create this whole bureaucracy around conducting those verifications. And all of that is pointed to remove people from programs as opposed to expand them to catch more people who are falling through the cracks of the safety net. And so I think in addition to helping to cut through that inefficiency that is created as a result of the suspicion of low-income people as welfare frauds, instead we can rethink what we mean by value, the human costs of these systems, and the way we think about our ethical values, our moral values, and the value of a safety net to begin with.
What about the universal basic income model and meeting the needs that traditional government struggles to address?
I think if you look at the CARES Act, which, as you mentioned, CARES Act and ARPA lifted so many people out of poverty, but at the same time, $5.3 billion of CARES Act money went to 600 private equity-backed companies, $200 million to weapons manufacturers, and CARES Act stimulus payments excluded undocumented essential workers. And so I think an economy and a society that really does care, really does uplift workers, and really does understand people and human beings as essential would apply the principles of universal basic income, which is that there should be a floor below which nobody should fall, and that there's a right not to die of poverty in the richest country in the world, and applies that logic to the design of the infrastructure that we create and the decisions that are made about where to invest our public dollars.
Right. Nika, did you want to ask Brian any questions about vendors or actors in this system?
On that note, will you talk about how the voucher system was designed, what kinds of partners were in the room, and what the current movement at HUD is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the voucher program sort of has, three key actors. There's four key actors. So HUD sort of sends the money to public housing authorities. There are public housing authorities, landlords, and tenants. And there are two places here where I think the kind of conversation about bureaucracy is particularly important as we think about direct rental assistance. So one is landlords, right? One of the challenges that we've seen over the last decade is landlords are declining to participate in the program. They're saying we don't want to rent to voucher holders, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe their sort of counterfactual tenant is not that different than a voucher holder, but the bureaucracy of working with public housing authorities has become tremendous for many landlords, right? They have to, as Nika said, they have to go through an inspection process. It often takes many months before the inspection can happen. So their unit is sitting vacant, right? There's a tenant that wants to come in, but the unit is sitting vacant because, right, they have to go through that inspection process. For the landlord, they sign two contracts, right? One with the tenant pays 30% of their income on rent, so there's a contract between the landlord and the tenant, but there's also a contract between the landlord and the public housing authority for the rest of the rent. So for a lot of landlords, they've decided, hey, listen, this is too bureaucratic, right? There's too much paperwork, there's too much time wasted, we don't want to participate in the program, and in a hot housing market, maybe you don't have to, right? So that's one side. And then also, as Nika said, for the housing authority, right? Housing authorities are selecting tenants from the wait list, certifying their eligibility, helping them navigate the private market. I remember in my research before I came to HUD, a director of a housing authority told me that for every person that's going to lease up in the voucher program, get a voucher and actually find a unit, they have to call 10 people off the waiting list. And the reason, she said, there's a 50-50-50 rule, and it's basically, right, there's some combination of this at every housing authority, that when you call people off the waiting list, half of them don't respond, right? Probably because they've been on the waiting list for years and years, and they moved, they didn't update their contact information, people live busy lives, and they missed the letter. Half the people don't respond. Of the people that do respond, there's so much eligibility paperwork, they can't prove their income or their over income. They were selected because they were experiencing homelessness, but they can't prove that they're experiencing homelessness, right? So half the people that are selected turn out not to be eligible for the program. And then those that are eligible and get the voucher, right, about half of them don't end up finding housing, right? So, but what a disheartening number after all of this for a public housing administrator to say, if I want to get one person housed, I got to call 10 people off that wait list and go through that, right? So those are sort of the bureaucratic things that I think that we're working through. And I want to sort of acknowledge some of the really good work that HUD is doing too, in two fronts. One is, the voucher program works well for a lot of people, and I think we don't need to sort of throw that away in this conversation, right? So there are folks that are very stably housed, have been housed for a long time, were able to find housing, are stable. The voucher program is working well, and I think that's just an important thing sort of from the HUD side that's important to acknowledge. And the other is that HUD is doing a lot of work sort of mostly around the edges to try to make it easier, right? So we have a new set of inspection standards called the Inspire standards that are different than our previous ones. We're encouraging housing authorities not to have to do an annual income recertification, but to do it biennially, right? So these things that kind of on the margins are improving the program for some tenants. Even with those, right, there's a need for sort of much bigger rethinking. So, but that's kind of the set of players that are involved in this conversation at HUD. And then just, Nika, you had asked a little bit about sort of where the conversation is at HUD. So for us, this started about 2 years ago, and it started with us learning from the guaranteed income community, right? There's all these pilots, there's evidence, right? There's evidence of what people are spending their money on when they get income, and they're spending it largely on housing, right? So we learned from work that was out there, and we said, like, one of the things that's possible to imagine is Congress allocates $32 billion a year for the voucher program. It's not enough, but that's a substantial allocation, and could we think about kind of that allocation being used in a different way? So what started as this sort of small idea within the policy shop at HUD has really grown to have buy-in of the Office of Public and Indian Housing. They run the voucher program to think about demonstrations. We have a really terrific acting secretary who's interested in sort of big ideas, and she's interested in this is a big idea. We have a set of agencies, public housing agencies called Moving to Work agencies that have administrative flexibility, and we're going to let them sort of run these kinds of demonstrations if they want to. So sort of very quickly within the bureaucracy, this idea has taken off as something that we should try and that we should think about and that we should test, which is I think is really gratifying to know that kind of even these sort of lumbering organizations, right, can see a glimmer of a good idea and think, let's walk down that road, sort of see what happens as we go down that road.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I mentioned discrimination earlier, and we'll get to it later, but one of the things that's difficult for people is that they're seen as, they're clearly identified as somebody that is poor, is in poverty in order to get these programs, and it just makes them feel less than, and the landlords may look at them as less than. To have it be a guaranteed income where they just pay their rent just like any other renter, I think that's really important. I know the government has made changes in that in terms of food systems. Yep. So this sounds really what we need, the direction that we need to go in. It's more about recognizing the dignity and respecting the individual and not labeling them. Yeah. Nika, you mentioned community design programs. Could you tell us what works best for landlords and tenants, what you have found in the places that you've done it?
To build off of what Brian said, actually, one of our view of universal basic income isn't that it's replacing existing programs, because the voucher program does work for a lot of people. Instead, it's a supplement to existing programs, because as we've been talking about, it works for a lot of people, but it leaves a lot of people out. And so when we have this idea, it's also important to be in the room during its design, during its implementation. And as advocates and community members, we can sometimes get the policy wins, get the bills passed, but when it comes time to implementing it, that goes back to the same old vendors, the same old companies that built what didn't work before. And community members who are the real experts are excluded from procurement, which is how the government chooses what vendor to go to. And at the same time are told that there's not enough money, it takes too much time, that we need committee after committee to deliberate. And a part of addressing the root cause of the housing crisis is actually removing that false frame and demonstrating that it's possible to collaborate, to move quickly, and to design things that are new and actually relatively inexpensive. And so I think it takes bringing in experts who are invested in the system, the government we have. This is the only government we have. We can't throw it away. And so people like Brian, who work day in and day out in trying to improve the infrastructure that millions rely on, and universal basic income will thrive when it brings together that kind of cross-cutting coalition as a supplement to what already exists, as opposed to utopian dream of a way to ensure that when robots take over jobs, we'll all be okay.
Okay, Brian and Nika, do you have any last points that you'd like to make before we open up to questions?
Yeah, Jen, I just wanted to build off kind of with my sociologist, how we said about discrimination. I mean, I think that's another piece of this when we think about sort of dignity and choice, right, in the voucher program. There's an incredible amount of stigmatizing of voucher holders, of Section 8 tenants, by landlords and others. And I think a big part of this is, right, actually rethinking that stigma, right, doing away with that stigma that low-income renters are renters, right, like other renters, and they don't have to be labeled as Section 8 renters or Section 8 tenants. That, right, with a sort of direct rental assistance program, I think that takes away some of the stigma that's causing a lot of the discrimination on the housing market. And we know it's a huge problem, right? Even where there are source of income discrimination laws, right? Laws that make it illegal for a landlord to discriminate against voucher holders, right? We know that that happens because it's actually really difficult to sort of detect when discrimination is about right, source of income rather than about something else, or even when discrimination occurs. And so I think sort of even outside of the policy piece, just thinking about stigma in this program, DRA is an important step forward there.
And you feel that by doing it this way, you'll still be able to deal with racial discrimination or discrimination against sexual orientation? Or?
Yeah, I mean, these are incredibly hard things to detect on the housing market, and they're even harder in really hot housing markets, right, where landlords sort of have their choice of tenants. Mm-hmm. It's very easy, unfortunately, to sort of deny somebody for a discriminatory reason, but make it seem like it's, right, not that reason. So I think that's a challenge that we need to continue to address. And we do, I mean, one of the sort of HUD studies on discrimination, one of the things that we're learning is, right, discrimination is happening in new ways, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just, we can't do audit tests where we send out 2 people and sort of see who gets calls back, because that's not how the housing market works anymore, right? So, so I think this is also about the kind of innovation of the bureaucracy in a different space, right? To think about how is discrimination happening in the housing market today, what's different than it was 10 years ago, and sort of how can we detect and root that out.
Okay. Nika, any last words before questions?
Maybe just to say that I think to scale a community-led design approach requires doing away with the assumption that the expertise lies with the global tech companies, the consultants that built today's broken systems. And I was so grateful for the panel just before us, because in our federal government, there's 2.5 times as many contractors as there are government employees. And that's $1 trillion of federal, state, and local spending that goes directly to private companies as vendors. And by the way, these vendors build things that take a really long time. They're quite expensive. They don't work. And we need to fundamentally divest from the systems that don't work. Otherwise, housing, as we see increasingly, is turned into an information management problem or a data problem, as opposed to a construction problem or a political will problem. And in LA alone, there was hundreds of millions of dollars spent on a homelessness management information service system that coordinates from different service providers what services are available and then helps refer people to it. Only to get into that system, the form was so complicated that around 11,000 people who are unhoused in LA were unable to even access the referrals. At the same time, police are violently destroying homeless encampments, calling it sanitation sweeps or worse, care sweeps. And from the 30,000 people who were swept away, only 63 were removed to permanent supportive housing. So the out of sight, out of mind mentality is not going to work, and it is the exact opposite from a structural solution to a solvable problem.
Excellent. So any questions? Yes, Mike? Gary?
So my daughter has a developmental disability, and so she was prioritized on the Section 8 list, and it took 2 years to get the Section 8 certificate. My question is, what would it take to wipe out waiting lists totally?
Yeah. Political will. I mean, right, it's possible to do. We know how much it would cost to give a voucher to every single person. Congress just has to allocate that money. I think in this particular case, so one of the ways that the administration is sort of thinking about this is, right, the likelihood of getting a universal voucher program realistically in this political climate is pretty low. But what we can do is actually ask for mandatory spending for certain categories of folks that we think are especially at high risk, right? So in the president's budget, there's an ask for mandatory spending on vouchers for veterans and mandatory spending on vouchers for those leaving the foster care system, right? It's sort of two categories, right, of folks that have high housing needs, high housing instability. And so I think part of the thinking here, like the political strategy here is, going out and asking for a universal voucher program that covers everybody is politically not feasible right now. But thinking about sort of categories of folks that are experiencing high levels of housing instability, right? Folks with experiencing homelessness, disabilities, the elderly, right? And can we think about those as categories where there should be mandatory spending, right? People that are entitled to those should get them. But wiping out sort of waiting lists, right, simply requires more vouchers.
Exactly. Any sense of the cost, though? Could you put a dollar amount behind that?
I can, but not off the top of my head. It's too much math right now.
Other questions? There's some over there.
Hi, thanks. I'm just curious about a number of things. So as a progressive policy, UBI is certainly an exciting, model, and questions about the benefits cliff aside and how you mitigate the benefits cliff. And I was just interested to hear Nika pivot to a statement that the UBI would be supplemental at the end of your conversation, because it sounded through most of your presentation like it was an exchange. It would be one for the other. So you would get the GBI, not the voucher. And as you have a little nexus of people here who would probably spend the next 2 days talking about this issue with you. But the kind of implications of what you're saying, we all know the problems with the vouchers. You will still have housing discrimination. You will still have all of those problems. The voucher system is one of the greatest wealth-building federal programs that's ever happened. And despite all the problems, it has, particularly in the 70s and 80s, for Black families, helped them close the wealth gap. It was the only time in history that the vouchers helped Black families close the wealth gap. The voucher program problems come and go. They ebb and flow. We've seen these problems before. Foreclosure crisis, early gentrification, Reagan years, we've seen these problems come and go. These problems are temporary, but the voucher program itself, the infrastructure that delivers the voucher program has its problems, but it has overwhelming benefits in terms of wealth building for people at the lowest rung. And to pose it as a solution is concerning. How do you mitigate the risk of Congress not allocating enough UBI from year to year? Mm-hmm. We have an institutionalized infrastructure. It's almost like saying you would do UBI instead of Medicaid or UBI instead of food stamps. So the way your presentation came out was, not necessarily threatening, but from, if you look at all the data and you look at the institutionalized infrastructure and all the delivery mechanisms on the ground, I think it would be important to involve practitioners in your conversation who have been doing this for 30 years and have seen these ebbs and flows.
Liz, I really just want to say that what we're trying to do is talk about some innovative new programs, but I think Brian has expressed a couple of times today that the voucher program would continue, that this is not an either or. It's innovative thinking about how to improve services and how to deal with some of the ongoing issues.
And I really appreciate that question too, because you reflect exactly my fear about the overexcitement about universal basic income as a replacement and actually ultimately a reduction of welfare spending. Yeah. And that's not the approach to the policy that I think is appropriate. And there's a difference between that broader, should we do away with vouchers and replace it with cash? In my view, no. But for the purpose of this pilot, what we mean by cash to supplement the existing voucher program is for a 1-year pilot. In the months that you would otherwise be waiting to get your assistance until you lease up, in those months you will be receiving direct cash that is the rough equivalent of what the voucher amount would be. And then after you sign the lease agreement with the landlord, after that 1 year of direct cash, then that lease agreement gets converted into, the cash gets converted into a voucher. And so it's a cash on-ramp for the months that a renter is leasing up with the voucher that then supplements the voucher program. So in a sense, it's temporarily replacing the unusable voucher, but it's actually inserting more aid to a low-income renter. And ultimately, the goal isn't to replace the voucher program or to show its deficiencies. It's instead to fix an existing problem area for the program. And I think it's one of the best ways that we can demonstrate the real significance and the role that guaranteed income can play as a supplement to existing programs, because I think too often it's thought of as a replacement. And in fact, that's a very different vision for society than guaranteed income's political home, which is the Poor People's Campaign, which is point 2 of the Black Panthers' 10-point plan. It's not about reducing the amount of infrastructure we have to keep people safe. It's instead about investing more in people.
Sounds like the fast road into the same voucher program, but to get rid of some of those waiting lists.
Yeah. Well, and Jane, can I just, I want to give a lot of credit to Nika too for this idea of cash as an on-road to the voucher program is not how we had started thinking about this at HUD, right? We had been thinking about cash pilots for a couple of years. And so I think it's a model of what happens when people from different, I come institutionally from HUD, and as a researcher, Nika comes from the guaranteed income community, and putting those together, right? This is a really exciting, probably more cost-effective, probably can serve more people model that sort of hadn't been the origins of our thinking on this. And I think there are lots of ways to run these pilots. My hope is that we run them in a bunch of different ways and sort of collect that evidence. But like really to Nika and to her team for sort of putting those pieces together, right? And this model I think is really smart. I just want to reflect on one other piece about the voucher program. So I'm not familiar with the sort of wealth building research and would love to learn more about it. I think we don't really think of the voucher program as a wealth building tool, right? As a rent supplement. But one of the things that we do know, in sort of going back to who it works for and who it doesn't, right? There are certain kinds of families that have an easier time with the voucher program, right? They face less discrimination. They may need a more shallow subsidy. They have experience in navigating the housing market. And so one of the things that sort of we need to think through on kind of who the voucher program is working through and who cash might be a sort of better option is to understand people's experiences of the housing market, people's experiences of navigating programs, and really think about tailoring programs to the communities that they're going to work the best for. And this again goes back to one of the things that Nika's really brought to this conversation, right, which is about centering those community voices and understanding, right, from communities about where this is working and what the challenges are, not just from sort of, academics like myself who have done this work, but really on the ground, how's this program working and how can this design sort of assist communities that are having the most struggle on the housing market?
Okay. Can we take one more question?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for such a thoughtful discussion. It seems to me, looking at the political will of reducing healthcare costs, that this would be an excellent opportunity to bundle those two issues. And let me give you some specific examples. When kids live in substandard housing with roaches and vermin and all that, going to the emergency department for asthma exacerbations is a significant cost, not just to healthcare, but also to things like education. That's one example. When disabled people and families this was devastating during COVID, devastating. We forget about sort of minorities within minorities, certainly the elderly. So can you bundle those two to get the political will to increase? Because, and I'm sure you've got data about how housing impacts in a positive way healthcare costs. The second comment that I will just make, in Washington, D.C., 1 in 3 people are functionally illiterate, and health literacy is huge, and then, of course, the digital divide. So it's kind of ridiculous to think that people can navigate these systems, at least the majority of people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can share real quickly on kind of from the federal side. So, one thing, right, that underlies this, we know the impact of safe, affordable, decent housing on health and education and feelings of well-being and mental health and safety, right? So the evidence is very clear about sort of housing as the baseline. I'll just sort of address two things that the federal government is doing in kind of the housing health nexus. So one is about Medicaid and using Medicaid to pay for housing costs. It's really new and innovative, and we're working with HHS on this. Kind of very nascent in this, but it's a huge idea that's come up. And so I think we'll be pushing much more in that direction. We're actually doing in the Office of Policy Development, we do a quarterly update every quarter on a big topic, and our September one will be on this, right? Sort of about Medicaid and housing, because it is, as you say, like such an important piece of this. Housing quality being a big issue. I mean, when the voucher program was started, housing quality was a huge issue, and it's less an issue now, right? The quality of the American housing stock has improved, but it's not a non-issue, right? And so things like lead paint, right, mold, overcrowding even as a sort of health issue, right? These are still things that persist in segments of the housing market that I think we're attuned to, but a huge part of the work around housing is actually because housing is the baseline of, right, all of these other things, including health.
Well, thank you both. I think it's heartening to hear that there's some innovation going on at Housing and Urban Development, and a lot more. I know that there are a lot more programs that you're looking at that we don't have time to discuss today. And the Fund for Guaranteed Income, I think, is a wonderful organization, and it's exciting that you're able to work with, I think, 12 American cities and then places all across the country. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Hey. Whoops.